Thanks very much for coming. My name is Gavin McFadgen, and I'm the director of the Center for Investigative Journalism here at City University. Though probably not for much longer at City University, but here nonetheless. This is an unusual meeting in that it's a sort of pre-launch of a launch and celebration all at the same time. Because on the 20th of March, a new organization will launch itself on an unsuspecting public, which will be called The Whistler, and it will be a support and defense organization for lots of whistleblowers in this country who need the kind of support that they're not really getting anywhere else. And legal support, psychological support, and we hope other kinds of support as well. Because as Eileen will tell you in a minute, whistleblowers here don't have an easy ride of it, as they don't have anywhere. But we thought it was time that not just a legal organization representing them, but a real support mechanism should be in place. And that's what we've set out to do, and that's what the Whistler will be. It's an organization of whistleblowers that will launch next month, mid-March, and it has in it Compassion and Care, which is an organization set up and organized and founded by Eileen Chubb. She was one of the Bupa 7 who blew the whistle on elderly patients' abuse, which I think some of you have seen on television and read about in countless articles, which was a critical thing. And in terms of raising the alarm about the treatment of the vulnerable and those who were defenseless in institutions. It was a singular thing of great importance. Similarly, we also have a bunch of other organizations who will be joining us later. We founded together, Eileen and I, this group, which was funded in a sense by a strange grant we got from a Dutch foundation. Nobody in this country would fund it, but we got somebody in Holland who was prepared to fund it, which was very nice. And towards that end, we've been able to make documentary films and all the rest of it about what we do and how it is to be a whistleblower. And I thought we'd structure the meeting in this way, that Eileen would speak first about what it's like in Britain and what's happening here. And then we would introduce a panel of our American guests here who we're really privileged to have, who represent a wide variety of courageous opinion in the States, people who took enormous risks to do what many of us really admire, and which we're in a way almost indebted to them. We'll take a questions and answer at the end, and before that, there's yet another organization that is forming, a very important one, called the Courage Foundation. And Annie Machin, who's a former MI5 officer, will tell us about that. But first, Eileen.
Hi. My name's Eileen Chubb, and I blew the whistle on abuse in a Bupa care home in 1999. We were the first ever case to use the Public Interest Disclosure Act. We were in the system for 2 years. It was a total nightmare. We were blacklisted. We could find no other work. We applied for hundreds of jobs. As soon as you said your name, they said, are you one of them Bupa women? So I realised the hardship and that people weren't protected. We finally received the verdict, and we were told that we hadn't sufficiently considered the consequences to ourselves before we reported the abuse. Luckily, I have a supportive family. My husband said, if you don't fight this, you'll damn everyone who comes after. Bupa tried to buy us off. I was asked to name my price, and my answer was, you can poke your money, because it was never about money. The people I looked after were my friends, so to me there was no question. Since that time, I've run a helpline, founded Compassion and Care, which is a charity that exposes abuse in care homes and in hospitals. But I also, 30% of the whistleblowers that come to me are not from the care sector. I don't turn any whistleblower away. Evidence from 1,500 whistleblowers, regardless of age, of class, of what area they're working in, the same problems again and again. Firstly, if they blow the whistle internally and then nothing is done about the abuse, they're left with the choice of going outside, and then their employer will know it's them. And that is happening on a huge scale, where they've told their employer they followed the whistleblowing procedure and nothing has been done. And then they ring me and say, I can't go outside because I've got 3 young children, I can't pay my mortgage, I can't afford to go any further with this. The second thing that comes up is that people are driven out of their jobs. I know what it's like to have to walk into a wall of hate each day, and people are frightened to go to work. I mean, we were physically assaulted on the premises. I was hit in the back with a chair. The day we left the building, Bupa bought all the staff a box of chocolates. So I know the fear and what happens to people, and they just either resign or they're forced to go sick, and that's happening in every single case. The other thing that is happening is long-term detriment. As soon as you say you're a whistleblower, you may as well say you're a paedophile, because you are unemployable. And what's happening is people are applying for hundreds and hundreds of jobs and they can't get any work. You know, they get an interview, but if they say that they blew the whistle in their last job, they don't get the job. So that is a huge problem. The other thing that comes across to me, I mean, every day, I run a helpline. Unlike public concern at work, the helpline that I run, I end up crying with people, because it absolutely shames me that people could be treated like that in a civilized country, that, you know, they could be left destitute, you know, that have to make the choice between trying to save someone's life or trying to have, you know, an income. And nobody should have to make that choice. It's so wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. So that's why I become involved with this, because I'm so passionate about it. And I've lived through the law, and very few cases make it into the courts. And I think that we can do so much good. And I'd like to welcome our American colleagues here today, and I'm proud to know you. And this is the beginning of a very exciting organisation that will change things, because it's the whistleblower's voice that has to be heard, and currently that is not happening. They are not protected.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're very pleased that tonight, as many of you know, a whole group of American whistleblowers have come, and we'll speak about some of the highest profile cases that we all know, that you can read about them every day, and chat about some of that. We're going to take questions and answers at the end, and we still will do, so if you can save any serious questions for the end, that would be great, and we'll try to get those done. We have 3 to speak, and we're also lucky to have a whole number in the back of the hall as well, who've done extraordinary things, and perhaps if you want to speak a little later, you can too. But we have Ray McGovern, who's a former CIA senior analyst, who blew the whistle. We have Jesselyn Raddick at the other end over there, a former U.S. Department of State Justice advisor, Department of Justice, forgive me, ethics advisor, and now chief counsel to the Government Accountability Project. Is that correct? And Edward Snowden's legal advisor. That's the bad part, you know. And Thomas Drake, a former senior NSA official, who has acted on his conscience and paid no small price for his courage. And we're particularly pleased that they're here to speak. And Ray, you first, perhaps, if you would.
Well, thank you. I can't get out of my mind the words of my Irish grandmother, who would say, "Show me your company and I'll tell you who you are." Well, I can see her, you know, shining down from the heavens now, saying, "Well, Raymond, you're finally falling with some good company, not those fellas you used to hang out with." As some of you know, I served for 27 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. I learned a lot about whistleblowing. And before I go into that, I just want to say that Eileen's presence here reminds me of the first whistleblower with whom I became acquainted, and her name is Frances Kelsey. Does anyone know who she was? She was the Food and Drug Administration, a PhD scientist who single-handedly prevented the drug thalidomide from coming onto the American market. I served in Germany a few years after she had successfully prevented that from coming onto the American market, and I was very distressed to see the tangible evidence of what happened in Europe here, where that drug was abundant, mostly for women who were pregnant and had trouble sleeping. So there's a quite great tradition, Eileen, that you are furthering by your efforts here in the health field. The other thing I'll say is simply that I have been blowing the whistle very loud, but only after I left government. It was really only after I left government that I could see with distinct clarity that my former colleagues had been suborned into manufacturing evidence to support an unnecessary war, a war of aggression in Iraq. The evidence was not mistaken, my friends. The evidence was fraudulent. When Senator Rockefeller reported after a 5-year study by the Senate Intelligence Committee, he said the evidence used to justify Iraq was unsubstantiated, contradicted, or even non-existent, period, end quote. This is serious, folks. What does non-existent intelligence look like? Now, to my great regret, when I had a chance to blow a very consequential whistle during the Vietnam War, I lacked the guts of a Thomas Drake, a Jesselyn Radek, an Ed Snowden, a Chelsea Manning, a Daniel Ellsberg. It's a long story, but I'll make it very short. When I was an analyst in the CIA, I learned that in 1967, the command in Saigon, and you may remember this, was deliberately halving the number of enemy troops in South Vietnam, enemy troops, communists under arms in South Vietnam. General Westmoreland said they could not be more than 299,000. My colleagues, whom I trusted, said there were at least 500,000. This was a real problem. People were dying, okay? Well, I knew that there was a cable that came in from Westmoreland's deputy, and it said, and I quote, "We can't go with the upper numbers because we have been projecting an image of success in this war, and there is no way, despite all the caveats and all the explanations we can adduce, there is no way to prevent the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion, period," end quote. General Abrams, Westmoreland's deputy, wrote that cable. He was a great tanker during World War II, but he didn't know much about, putting on the line perjured evidence. And so I had an opportunity to ask my colleagues for that cable, take it down to the New York Times, which in those days, for the younger of you, it was an independent newspaper in those days. And if you gave them a cable saying this war was fraudulent, they didn't go to the White House and say, what do you think we should? They were put on the front page, okay? So all I'm saying here is that I have great regret that before that war was half old, when only 22,000 U.S. service people had been killed, not 58,000, when only 1 million, not 3 million Vietnamese were killed, I didn't have the guts to do what I should have done and revealed that information. Who knows what would have happened, but I know it would have appeared on the first page of the New York Times, 1967. Those of you who are familiar with the Vietnam Memorial in Washington know it's in the shape of a V, all right? Now, that left V wouldn't be there because there'd be no names to chisel into that wall, okay? And so my friend Sam Adams, who was the Vietnamese analyst, and I live with this regret that we didn't do what the others of you did have the courage to do. And now I feel as though I can legitimately look up to the rest of you and say whatever I can do to use my negative example in furtherance of people who have a positive example and don't have to live with the regret that I have, that I will do that, and I will speak out as people allow me to, and thank you for allowing me.
Pleasure. Thomas, Did you want to go next?
Yes. I'm reminded of being here in the United Kingdom, which I consider my second home, having lived here for well over 6 years in a previous life, once as a very small child, and then when I flew in RC-135s during the latter years of the Cold War out of RAF Mildenhall. I was once again reminded about two nations divided by a common language. Because on the way to one of our, lost count of number of media appearances we had, was instructing the taxi cab driver to make his way over to your place. And I said Morton, and he took it as Morton and went in a different direction to a different address. And I realized that because given the technology I was carrying, I noticed that the little dot was rapidly moving away from the red dot that was fixed in your location. He was a gentleman. He only charges £5 from the previous location because he accepted it as his mistake, and I accepted it based on the problem in translation. I say that because there's been an extraordinary special relationship between the United States NSA and the UK's GCHQ. But what's being created here tonight is an entirely different relationship that is more than just special. This transcends who we are and all the traditional filters of empire and power and secrecy. Because how would we know what the empires and the secret powers are up to without whistleblowers and truth tellers? I myself was confronted by this stark reality in the days and weeks after 9/11, when 9/11 was my first day on the job as a senior executive at NSA. I discovered to my horror the very Constitution that I had taken an oath at that point 4 times to support and defend was now being subverted in the name of national security. And I was faced with the stark reality that the very Constitution be born out of a violent American Revolution against the Crown, to include reasons of massive usurpations of power and denying people the ability to associate freely, and writs of assistance in which an agent of the Crown can literally show up at your doorstep and take not only you away, but everything that was in your abode. And so I was faced with the stark reality that the very vehicle in which the government was founded upon, not only had the wheels come off, but we were in an entirely different vehicle, and I did not recognize it. It was an anathema form of government. And I had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The horror that I face was now having to defend the very Constitution that I had taken an oath to support and defend against my own government. That the government itself had become the enemy. Little did I know at that time that I would end up being declared an enemy of the state by holding up the mirror. And so in those weeks and months after 9/11, it was an extraordinarily compressed few weeks and months for me, I was eyewitness to the stark reality that the greatest of secrecy, the White House, in collusion with NSA, had decided to engage in a secret surveillance program that not only the United States had never seen, but ultimately the world would have never seen or experienced before. Completely unchaining itself from the Constitution, total violation of the 4th Amendment, and turning the United States of America into the equivalent of a foreign nation for dragnet electronic surveillance. I was there as an eyewitness at the very foundation set of programs that Edward Snowden has disclosed in great detail and will continue to do so through journals and reports in which he provided information in the form of material evidence documentation. Now in my case, I realized that if I remained silent, I would be complicit. If I remained silent, I'd be an accessory to a crime. Yes, I went through every conceivable channel that existed. I believe Jessalyn has said in the past publicly that she's never known someone to use every channel that existed, and then some. Because I knew that if I went outside the system and at that time, that my ability to affect change or bring to light what was necessary to bring to light to those those in government who had responsibility and accountability, that I would be instantly fired. So I did make a choice at the time. I've spoken at great length with this with Dan Ellsberg, that I would work within the system until I no longer could do so. And I ended up working with those, disclosing to those within NSA. And then I ended up disclosing to those outside of NSA, but within the government, to include the intelligence committees who had responsibility for the secret side of government based on violations that NSA itself had committed in secret during the 60s and 70s and even in the decades preceding. I also was eyewitness to significant intelligence failures surrounding 9/11, that NSA had critical intelligence that it had never shared, that if it had been shared, could have easily stopped 9/11 all by itself, which was actually the ultimate reason, as I was explaining to Ray in additional detail over at the Peasant Pub, in additional detail as to why they actually came after me. The dirty knowledge of the secret state, knowing that it had the evidence, had chosen not to share it prior to 9/11, and then covered it all up and then some afterwards. In fact, all of the evidence in which I brought forward to 2 9/11 congressional investigations, thousands and thousands of pages within channels, was all suppressed and censored. In fact, the only evidence that exists that I had any connection with the 2 9/11 congressional investigations was the fact that I was interviewed. That's the only record that apparently exists. I also was eyewitness to massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse. That American taxpayer money was being used to support a program when in fact another program that was developed for just a few million had already solved. But NSA, in its infinite wisdom, decided that we're going to buy the solution for many, many billions, and we're going to go out to the military industrial complex to do so. Because the big data problem required big dollars, and big dollars required big contracts, and it required a lot of years. So the end result was I ended up making a fateful decision to go to the press, because if all of the available avenues within government fail, then the last resort was the Fourth Estate. And by going to the Fourth Estate, I knew that that was fraught with extraordinary peril. This is post 9/11. And as it turns out, they already launched a massive national security leak investigation to find the sources for the blockbuster article written by James Risen and Eric Liplau in December 2005, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program, which in itself was only the tip of the iceberg. And so to make a long story short, and why it's so crucial and why we're here as advocates standing up for why we need whistleblower support and advocacy organizations. Because who else is going to give voice to what's going on inside government? Who else is going to give voice to those things that go on behind the scenes in corporations? Who else is going to hold up the mirror to power? Who else is going to speak truth to power? I ultimately was put under extreme investigation, so extraordinary electronic surveillance and physical surveillance. I was ultimately raided by the FBI unceremoniously. I was ultimately charged under the Espionage Act. I was the first whistleblower since Dan Ellsberg to be charged in like manner. And when I was indicted in April of 2010, after it took 2.5 years for the government to figure out how to do so, I faced 35 years in prison. And I knew that everything that I lived for and everything that I had stood for was now at stake. And I knew I was going to do everything possible to ensure that I would be able to see it through and retain my freedoms and my liberties and my rights. Because I knew that I was being made the exemplar, the case example, that the Obama administration was now on a ruthless campaign against truth tellers and whistleblowers, not knowing at the time that I was just the first, that there was others to follow. I was well aware of the national security investigation. I was well aware, okay, having gone to the press, right, into early 2006, the NSA had special programs that were monitoring reporters and journalists on an extraordinarily large scale. What I didn't, and I was at this point bankrupt. I was broken and I had been fully blacklisted. I had resigned a couple of years earlier. I could not find work. I ended up finding work in retail, which I still am because I'm still unable to find any other work that's permanent. And so after I was indicted, it was not just and I was declared indigent before the courts. I had no other recourse, no other attorney came to my defense, no one would touch me. I was radioactive, and it's national security. And because it was under the Obama administration, and because it was the first case like this in Dan Ellsbury, I must have done something really, really bad. I must have truly caused exceptionally grave damage to the national security of the United States. Why else would the Obama administration be charging me in like manner under the Espionage Act? Remember, in terms of US, UK Crown history, I was now the Benedict Arnold. You were once one of us, you're now one of them. I was a turncoat, I was a traitor. I had been on the inside. Now we're going to assure you were fully punished for your deeds. I knew that I would have to find a way to influence the court of public opinion. What I did not know at the time, on April 15th, when I got that phone call from my personal lawyer at the time, I did not know how that would come about. And so to make a long story short, and why it's so crucial, and why we're here to lend our full voice, our full weight, our full advocacy for the very organization that you're launching, is that Jessalyn Radack wrote this extraordinary op-ed in the LA Times, in which I realized, and as I finished her op-ed, which was written just a few days after I was indicted, that there was someone who actually got what was at stake. She was literally the first person. Ellsberg was the second, and in terms of reporters and journalists, Glenn Greenwald went on the record regarding why this was such a crucial case. That it opened up a huge rift, a huge tear in terms of what the Obama administration clearly was setting a mark down. That you're not going to hold up the mirror to what's going on inside the government. And we're going to punish you, and we're going to punish you hard. I ultimately contacted Jessalyn a few days later, and Jessalyn led my defense in the court of public opinion. She was my voice when I had none. She knew that if I ended up in prison, the government not only would have won their case, but obviously would have already sent the most chilling of messages, but it would have rendered any of the public interest defense mute as a whistleblower. What Jessalyn was able to do with extraordinary skill, acumen, and leadership was turn the tide even in the mainstream media, that I wasn't just a Espionage Act leaker who had quote unquote caused exceptionally grave damage to the national security of the United States. I actually was blowing the whistle on government wrongdoing. I actually was blowing the whistle on government criminality. I was actually blowing the whistle on the fact that the government was actually making us less secure, not more secure. And so, at the end of the day, I was able to prevail in the federal district court, and entered into a plea agreement in which, on my terms, they agreed to drop all the 10 felony counts, and I pled out to a minor misdemeanor for exceeding authorized use of a computer. So, my life was changed forever. And I've dedicated the rest of my life, and I say this with some emotion now, especially where I am, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those extraordinary words in the Declaration of Independence from the Crown, for all the usurpations of power, because those are inalienable rights. How dare any power take away the sovereign rights of human beings, because that's the essence of who we are. How dare any power assume that we're just become subjects of power. How dare any power assume that they know what is in our best interests. Because ultimately, as is written in the preamble of the United States Constitution, the idea of how we were going to govern ourselves after the American Revolution, after the abysmal failure of the Articles of Confederation. We the people, in order to perform a more perfect union. And so it's a great honor to be here at this panel and in front of you all to support the announcement and rollout of this new organization, to provide support and critical advocacy, because when you blow the whistle, you historically blow the whistle. Whistleblowers have always done it by themselves. There's very few people. There's always the joke about a whistleblower. If a whistleblower blows the whistle, was there anybody around to hear it? This gives support and critical advocacy. Even journalists, reporters, how else do they report the news absent sources? Where do these sources come from? It's people that have information they provide to the press in the public interest. In the public interest. That's who we are. So thank you for listening.
Jess.
Hello, I'm Jessalyn Radak. I direct the National Security and Human Rights Program at the Government Accountability Project, a 36-year-old organization dedicated to representing and advocating for whistleblowers. I joined GAP because I myself have been a whistleblower in a case that most people probably won't remember. Shortly after 9/11, I blew the whistle in the case of the so-called American Taliban, John Walker Lind, when I insisted that his interrogation had to include his lawyer, advice I normally gave on a daily basis. But obviously in John Walker Lind's case, not only was he denied counsel, he was also our first glimpse of torture, and nobody even flinched. And I listened to many pronouncements by the Attorney General talking about how he had carefully, scrupulously guarded the rights of someone who was obviously being mistreated, and who foreshadowed what we later saw at Abu Ghraib. After I blew the whistle by turning over evidence that had been destroyed to the news media, I thought the end of my ordeal was over, but I had just unleashed the full panoply of government retaliation. I ended up ultimately being put under one of the first criminal leak investigations. There's actually really no such crime as leaking in the United States Code, but I was put under a leak investigation, referred to the state bars in which I'm licensed as an attorney, and put on the no-fly list, which is to prevent terrorists from boarding airplanes. So, as you can see, this retaliation, I mean, it was brutal. Luckily, I had a family support that helped get me through this, and some friends who remained steady and with me, despite the fact that I was quite radioactive after the New York Times called me a traitor, a turncoat, and a terrorist sympathizer. Because of what I went through, I decided that I was going to dedicate the rest of my life to representing whistleblowers. So as I tried to claw my way out of this wilderness that I was in for a number of years, also being blacklisted in the legal community, I ended up working for Congressman Alan Grayson. He's a congressman now. At the time, I represented whistleblowers blowing the whistle on defense contractors alleging Reconstruction fraud in Iraq. So that was therapeutic and socially useful. And I had a paying job for the first time in a long time. And then Alan, my boss, was elected to Congress, and luckily there was an opening at the Government Accountability Project, which is really a unique organization. We have about 24 people. 7 or so of them are lawyers. My program has 2 lawyers operating on a budget of $140,000 a year. Normally, when I first started at GAP, representing whistleblowers meant representing people who had blown the whistle on some kind of wrongdoing and had been demoted or transferred or had their security clearance pulled, and in the worst case scenario, were fired. However, under Barack Obama, for whom I campaigned, contributed, and voted for because I believed in the promises of openness and transparency, I am now representing whistleblowers who have been indicted and are being prosecuted, investigated and prosecuted under an antiquated, heavy-handed World War I law called the Espionage Act, which is meant to go after spies, not whistleblowers. I knew in Tom Drake's case, when I read about this man who had been indicted, I thought, for all the stuff I went through, at least I never got indicted. I mean, I knew we had really crossed the Rubicon, and it upped the ante of trying to litigate this kind of case, because now you had a criminal defense to mount, but also offensive things that you could do. In addition to doing that kind of litigation representation, my organization also has a whistleblower teaching tour. We go around the country trying to teach younger generations to be aware of these issues. We also have a legislative component that lobbies for different bills in Congress that will help whistleblowers. But I'm really glad to hear that the Courage Foundation and Whistler are coming into existence, and that your organization already exists, because I think you provide a critical component, especially one that we haven't been able to provide, which is the actual psychological assistance. Whistleblowers are incredibly isolated. The first thing I do with every whistleblower is try to introduce them to the usually very tiny universe of people who are similarly situated. So in Tom's case, that was a universe of one. Dan Ellsberg was the only other person who had been indicted under the Espionage Act for blowing the whistle on non-spy related issues. So I introduced Tom to Dan. I believe that finding kindred spirits, which we have in this room, and which has now been more possible to do because of advances in technology and the internet and social media. But that is so critical because it is such an isolating place. If you were indicted for espionage, believe me, your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues will find you suddenly radioactive. And you're in this suspended animation of hell for a number of years, and you aren't allowed to talk if you're a criminal defendant, because you could create impeachable information or accidentally create more information the government will turn around and use against you. So it is critically important to be able to give support to whistleblowers, whether it is financial, because every single whistleblower under the Espionage Act that I've represented, I've done so pro bono, because they have been bankrupted by the government. Tom was declared indigent. John Kiriaku's family, he and his wife were both let go from the CIA. They have 5 children. They ended up on food stamps. They moved to a tiny apartment from their big house. It is a drastic lifestyle change, because not only are you not bringing in a stream of income, but you are incurring legal bills that are astronomical. When people say Edward Snowden, the most recent in Obama's unfortunate, ill-advised campaign against whistleblowers, when people call for him to face the music, I don't think they realize facing the music is going to cost $1 to $3 million. And also, it's impossible to face the music under the Espionage Act, because the music is the wrong tune. It is a song, it's a cacophony of terrible sounds, basically, that the Espionage Act has no public interest defense. It has no affirmative whistleblower defense. It has no overclassification defense. You are basically so penned in by a proceeding that goes on largely in secret. If anyone else, I know some of you in here may have attended parts of the Manning trial, but as an attorney, a human rights attorney, I would go in there, and half the time you have no clue what's going on as a spectator watching, because so many things have occurred behind, under seal, off the record, behind closed doors. You have no idea what's going on. The pleadings are not public. There are all these decisions happening in secret. And same with a criminal trial under the Espionage Act. You can only examine the evidence against you in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, which Tom had specially made for him. Cost you taxpayers in the US about $400,000. You are hemmed in by the Classified Information Procedures Act to protect classified information. That means the government has to create substitutions or redactions, or as was suggested in Tom's case, the judge, the jury, and the lawyers would speak in a special code that would be known only to them, but the public would have no idea what was transpiring. It is literally the 21st century version of the Star Chamber. It's completely antithetical to a free and open democratic society. And I think right now we are at a point where we need to decide if we are a nation in decline or if we are going to eschew being a surveillance state and get back to our democratic roots and behave like democracies. And it's not just the US. I came over here and had an unfortunate interrogation at Heathrow by the Border Force in which I was asked about my clients and about attorney-client privileged information, and tried very hard to give the right answers because I did not want to be detained like David Miranda for 9 hours, or like Laura Portres, another American, or Jake Applebaum, another American. I think the treatment of journalists and lawyers at the border is deplorable in any country. It's happened in the US, it's happened here, it's happened in Germany. I think the treatment of whistleblowers is tragic. And for some reason, it's been very hard to convince journalists that whistleblowers are their lifeblood. They need whistleblowers, and they have been perfectly willing to burn their sources in far too many cases. That's why I have a list of journalists I trust, and it's about 5 of them. I'm glad to share names later. But seriously, I think this war on whistleblowers is not only occurring in America, it's very visible in America. Other countries don't even have the word whistleblower, or a similar word, maybe raton, really derogatory terms. And whistleblowers in other countries face the same kind of challenges that whistleblowers in the US do in terms of being ostracized and abandoned and blacklisted and bankrupted and having their families fall apart and ending up broken. And we want people instead to end up whole. I want people at the end of their whistleblowing journey to turn out like Tom Drake, who is going around the country right now talking about how important these issues are. To be like, you may have heard of Bill Binney, another NSA whistleblower. I never thought my 4 Republican whistleblowers, some of whom own guns, would be on the lecture circuit talking about the importance of the First Amendment and of the Fourth Amendment and of civil liberties. But I think you have civil libertarians. I mean, you take away the labels of Democrat, Republican, because obviously Obama's a Democrat and he certainly isn't acting progressive at all on these issues. I think these are universal issues of people speaking truth to power and the price that people historically have had to pay for doing that. It has been delightful to me that the burglars who broke into the FBI offices to reveal something called the COINTEL program in the US that occurred in the 60s and recently came out. Basically, they did that in support of Snowden. They came out and said, we broke into the building to expose secret programs being run by the national security agencies. And it was just amazing. And when people, unfortunately, a lot of people in the First Amendment community and the whistleblowing community and the open government community, I can't think of the right adjective, but disappointing is way too weak, but are hand-wringing. Well, we're conflicted about Snowden. It's important we're having this debate, but maybe we think he gave too much, or we don't like his hairstyle, or we don't know why he fled to Russia, and the usual things, you know. And I finally just said, it really bothers me sitting in here with in a room with all the people who are supposed to be on the good side, that all of these people are hand-wringing. I'm like, when the White House's own internal review panel said this domestic mass surveillance has to go, when a federal judge said the same thing, when the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, hardly a bastion of liberal progressivism, reached the same conclusion, when the tech giants said the same thing, and then when the New York Times did an editorial. It is hard to find courageous people, but when you do, you stick together. I've known Ray for a decade. I mean, these are ties that bind. I look out and I see so many familiar faces and other people that I've known and have been standing side by side with in these fights. But certainly having organizational support, as far as I know, I mean, there's the Project on Government Oversight, and there is something called the National Whistleblower Center, which is really a nonprofit front for their for-profit law firm. But I mean, I don't know any other organization like that is actually doing what we do. I would love for there to be more, but I would love for us actually, my ideal would be not to exist at all, because there wouldn't be a need. But unfortunately, national security and intelligence officials in the US have the least, read that as no, whistleblower protection. Corporate whistleblowers are far more protected in the US. And I'm not as familiar with the protections and lack thereof here. I believe you guys have a public interest defense of sorts, but you also have this draconian, no, maybe not even that, draconian anti-terrorism law that I seem to be, and some other people who are trying to fight the good fight seem to be maybe bumping up against, which is frightening because, again, no one involved in these activities are terrorists. So whether it's Tom Drake or John Kiriakou, I mean, I have a client, Tom Drake, who's free. John Kiriakou is in jail. He was a CIA officer who for the first time revealed that waterboarding was occurring, that torture was an official program at the CIA and not a few bad apples. And I think the only reason John Kiriakou is in jail, if he had actually tortured someone, he would not be in jail. But he blew the whistle on it, and he is in jail. And then I have a client in exile right now, not because he fled to Russia. He was en route to Latin America when the United States pulled his passport and stranded him in Russia. The only reason Ed Snowden is in Russia is because the United States orchestrated that. Meanwhile, like in Tom's case, we are working hard to turn the Titanic of public opinion, and finally I'm glad that now 60% of people in the US think that NSA did something wrong and support Edward Snowden. Those numbers were reversed, 60-40 the other way back in June. There's still a long way to go before we would get the ultimate result, which would be for him to be able to come back to his own country that he loves and that he is patriotic to. So I am really glad that organizations are forming to help raise money for whistleblowers and to help support them where they're legally, where they're psychologically, where they're, I mean, in whatever way is possible, because it is so important, and there's so little being done for them. It's almost, I mean, you literally become radioactive in a way. We have this real love-hate relationship with whistleblowers. We watch movies like Erin Brockovich, and we're all about whistleblowers, and Dan Ellsberg, the most dangerous man in America, and wow, he is amazing. But then if you look back at what people were saying about him, some of the people, enemies were saying about him in the past, it was the same labels, that he was a traitor. The people in power who didn't like what he had done. Yet we go through this pattern over and over and over again, and it's time to break it. So thank you for making that happen.
Thank you. Good. Now, we have a final speaker before the Q&A, and it's a former MI5 political officer, I guess? Intelligence officer, forgive me. And who's directly involved and one of the founders of the foundation which hopes to redress some of this for journalist sources and for whistleblowers, which is called the Courage Foundation. Annie Machin.
Well, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here this evening. Thank you very much to Gavin and to Eileen for organising this initial sort of international support event and launch for the Whistler in the UK, which I think is a vital recognition and also support network for whistleblowers coming out of every aspect of society. A lot of the focus tonight has been on intelligence whistleblowers, but what happens to them and how they are treated and the risks they face and the loss of jobs and income and way of life affects every whistleblower that comes out of every sector. It is a disgusting treatment for people of integrity across any sector in society. So thank you very much for the support you provide to everyone. And it's also a real pleasure for me to have so many people over from the States, intelligence whistleblowers mainly, and diplomats and military, who are here to honour another very brave whistleblower who's paying a very heavy price for what she did a few years ago, which is Chelsea Manning. Of course, you'll all be aware Chelsea is currently languishing in prison for a sentence of 35 years for exposing murder and the crimes of the US intelligence agency and the US military. And we are here, Ray particularly as the founder of the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence. And we are awarding the Sam Adams Award to Chelsea this year for what she did. So this is why we're all gathered here. And it's fascinating hearing the American perspective tonight, because you mentioned, Tom, that you as a country broke away from the good crown, the British crown, because you wanted to fight for your freedoms. And yet everything I'm hearing from all the American whistleblowers here this week is that the US has learned all too well the duplicity and the secrecy and the draconian cover-ups that the UK has refined over the last 100 years when it comes to their intelligence work. And yet you're going one step beyond, you're supersizing the concept of persecuting the whistleblower. Only the Americans could do that. Now, just very briefly, I speak from experience. As Gavin mentioned, I used to be an intelligence officer for the British Domestic Security Service, MI5, and resigned in the mid-1990s with my former partner, David Shaler, who went on to become a very notorious, very famous, whichever word you want to pick, whistleblower in the late 1990s. Now, we were only there for 6 years, and we saw a whole catalogue of things going wrong, including files on our democratic political masters, the government ministers, illegal phone taps on journalists, innocent people put in prison, even though MI5 had information that they were innocent, they failed to disclose at trial, bombs that could and should have been prevented put on UK streets which exploded and innocent people died. And then MI5 could lie to cover this up. Culminating in MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Gathering Agency, funding an illegal assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya back in 1996. Now, this was illegal under UK law, and MI6 was funding what became Al-Qaeda in Libya, our known terrorist enemies even then, to try and assassinate a foreign head of state, and innocent people were killed in this process. So we felt moved to resign and blow the whistle, and this is in the analog days, before the internet, before we could just go to WikiLeaks or any other wonderful organisation that could protect our proof. We had to go to the press, and we had to go on the run, preemptively, to avoid being thrown in prison and gagged for a few years. So we did an Edward Snowden, actually. This is probably the only other people who actually preemptively went on the run around a whistleblowing case from the intelligence agencies. Now, for this, David paid a pretty high price. Not as bad as the whistleblowers are facing in the US now, but pretty high even so. We had to go on the run, literally around Europe, and we had to live in hiding for a year. And he went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British state failed to extradite him from France to stand trial in 1998. And secondly, when he returned voluntarily in 2000 to face prosecution. And he went through 2 years of court cases and ended up being put in prison, sentenced, found guilty for a breach of the Official Secrets Act. So we know the price you have to pay. We also saw through this how the media can be manipulated and controlled to a certain extent by the intelligence agencies. And this is one thing that I find very distressing in every whistleblower case, is that they go to the journalists, they want to do something for the public good. They want to expose wrongdoing on the part of the secret state or on the part of their employers. And the journalists love this. They think, great, sexy whistleblower case. And they make their careers on the back of this. But all too often, they take the information, break the story, and then leave the whistleblower twisting in the wind. And this is something particularly that this new foundation, the Courage Foundation, hopes to rectify, to help the poor bloody whistleblowers. So the journalists can win the awards, the journalists can have a nice career. We want to provide help and a support network to the current existing whistleblowers, particularly coming out of the intelligence agencies, because they are automatically criminalised, but also to raise funds to pay for the legal defences of people coming out of this sort of environment, because they will automatically be prosecuted for what they do. So that is what the Courage Foundation hopes to do as well. And it's lovely that all these different networks, the Government Accountability Project, the Whistler, other networks across Europe are beginning to combine and share experience and share knowledge to help protect people from coming out of all sorts of environments. Now, just to finish, I think I mentioned earlier, it's interesting looking at how the US particularly is learning some really nasty bad habits from the UK in terms of secrecy protection. And it's amazing that they've been using this old antiquated law from 1917, the 1917 Espionage Act, to persecute and wage a war on whistleblowers coming out of the intelligence agencies in the US. Now, the UK is one step ahead. We have the 1911 Official Secrets Act to do precisely that, to persecute traitors. And they get 14 years in prison, not 35, 14, but it's still bad enough. Then we had a series of whistleblowers in the 1980s in the UK. So they revised the law specifically to criminalise whistleblowing. And this is the 1989 Official Secrets Act. The difference is they took away any public interest defence you might have if you come out of central government, the intelligence agencies or the military, and blow the whistle on criminality. And they said basically, if you are a serving or former officer and you speak to anyone outside your agency about anything, you will be prosecuted. This is the first law against whistleblowers, and all whistleblowers coming out of these backgrounds in the UK are specifically not protected by any other whistleblower legislation such as the Public Interest Disclosure Act of 1998. So it's a very vulnerable sector of whistleblowing society, should we call it. They are most likely the sort of people to actually witness the most heinous types of crimes, like fabricated intelligence to go into wars, illegal wars in the Middle East, like attacks against civilians, like murder, like the collateral murder video that Chelsea Manning revealed, and like the vast illegal global surveillance panopticon that Edward Snowden has revealed as well. He's just confirmed all our worst fears of what is going on. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg. So there is a crying need for whistleblowers, particularly coming out of these sectors. And there is a crying need for protection of those whistleblowers and recognition of the courage that they display, knowing what might happen to them. So this is why, with very great pleasure, I recognise the Government Accountability Project in America, the Whistler Project in the UK, and I hope that all of you will follow and support the Courage Foundation, because courage is coming from more and more of us. Thank you very much.